Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get the clearest insights from your sources. Today we're tackling, a really crucial and incredibly complex subject. We're diving deep into the historical forces behind the transatlantic slave trade. It's definitely a period filled with difficult truths, but understanding it is absolutely essential for grasping so much of our shared global history.
Absolutely. And in this deep dive, we'll be looking at the main drivers behind that European demand for enslaved labor. We'll also shed light on the really intricate and often just brutal ways people were acquired from Africa. And we'll examine the significant roles different European nations played. Really, our mission is to help you understand how the economic, social, and political factors all interconnected to shape this pivotal and just devastating period.
Okay, let's start unpacking this history. So let's get right to the heart of it. Why? Why was there this almost insatiable demand for enslaved people? The most immediate driver, as our research really highlights, was the huge need for labor in the European colonies across the Americas. We're talking the Caribbean, mainland, North and South America, places growing cash crops.
Yeah, think sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee. The profitability of these massive agricultural operations, it just became completely dependent on having a vast, cheap, and crucially controllable labor force.
And it wasn't static either, was it?
No, not at all. This wasn't just about keeping existing plantations going. As European powers expanded, grabbed more territory, the need for labor it exploded. New colonies, expanding the old ones, that required a huge workforce, clearing land, planting, harvesting on an industrial scale, extracting resources. And from their perspective, enslaved Africans quickly became seen as the most efficient and cost-effective source for all this.
Okay, so that sheer need for labor is clear. But there's sometimes a misunderstanding that it was always enslaved Africans. Our sources show a really critical shift happened. Initially, European colonizers tried other things, didn't they? Indigenous labor, even indentured servants from Europe.
Right.
So what changed? What caused that tragic pivot?
Yeah, this is a really critical point in how the system evolved. First, the indigenous populations in the Americas were just tragically decimated. European diseases, they had no immunity to smallpox, measles, influenza. The impact was catastrophic. And beyond disease, indigenous groups often fiercely resisted colonization. There was armed conflict, rebellion, which made them, in the eyes of the colonizers, unreliable as a labor source.
Right.
You mentioned the Spanish encomienda system earlier. It supposedly granted colonists rights to indigenous labor in return for protection and religious instruction, but in reality, it led to horrific exploitation and incredibly high death rates.
So that wasn't sustainable for them?
Not at all. Enslaved Africans, on the other hand, were perceived by Europeans, and this perception is key, as being more resistant to European diseases. Also, physically stronger and less likely to successfully escape because they were in a completely unfamiliar land, thousands of miles from home.
And this next part is, it's deeply disturbing, but absolutely central to understanding this. Beyond the economics, our sources hammer home that European ideas about race weren't just a side effect. They were a driving force.
Exactly.
These racist ideologies, they didn't just pop up as excuses later. They actively painted Africans as somehow inherently inferior, naturally suited for hard labor.
Which then let Europeans see themselves as superior and therefore entitled to exploit others.
It's chilling.
It really is. And what the sources reveal is this awful feedback loop. The demand for labor didn't just use existing prejudices. It actively fueled the creation and hardening of new, more extreme racist ideas. Ideas specifically designed to dehumanize Africans and justify enslaving them permanently. It wasn't just a handy rationale, it became the very foundation of the whole system.
A foundation for control, too.
Absolutely. Enslaved labor gave colonizers a systematic way to exert social control over these non-European populations. And running underneath all of it, every single part, was this incredibly powerful profit motive. The trade was immensely profitable.
First profit.
At every stage, from the capture, the horrific transport, the sale, and then the lifelong exploitation in the Americas, money was being made constantly.
And we need to be clear, this wasn't just rogue traders acting alone.
Not at all.
European governments, colonial authorities, they were deeply involved. They actively built the framework for this.
Right. They supported it, regulated it with laws, treaties, commercial agreements. They even granted monopolies to trading companies, gave them subsidies, military protection.
This was state-sponsored, essentially.
It had deep, deep institutional roots. It was embedded right into European state power and economics.
So given that overwhelming demand, that profit motive, that state backing, the next horrifying question is how? How did they actually acquire millions of people from Africa?
Yeah.
The sources detail a process that was, well, multifaceted and often incredibly brutal.
It started with European traders from Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, the Netherlands, setting up bases on the African coast.
Trading posts, forts, sometimes called factories?
Exactly. These became the sort of chilling hubs for commerce, but mainly for negotiation and holding captives.
And the main commodity they wanted.
Enslaved Africans. In exchange, they offered various goods, textiles, guns, alcohol, metal items, other luxury goods.
Yeah.
This bartering formed the basis of many deals.
But it wasn't always just straightforward trade or even direct violence, though that happened.
Right.
There were also complex negotiations, right? European traders engaged in diplomacy, sometimes deceptive, with African chiefs and leaders to get their cooperation.
Yeah, they did. This often involved signing treaties or agreements, formalizing trade relations, maybe setting boundaries, or even forming alliances.
But the threat of force, or actual force, was always there.
Oh, absolutely. The sources are very clear on this. European traders often used coercion and violence. They might stir up conflicts between rival African groups, maybe arm one side specifically to get captives in return.
A deliberate strategy?
A deliberate and cynical strategy. Or they'd conduct their own raids on villages to capture people directly.
And they didn't always act alone on the ground either.
No, that's crucial. They often relied heavily on African intermediaries. Local merchants, sometimes established slave traders themselves, interpreters, people who knew the languages, the networks, the local politics. These intermediaries, sometimes acting under duress or navigating very complex power situations themselves, ended up playing a vital, facilitating role in the trade. It's a complicated aspect.
Let's look more closely at the African side of these interactions. What do the sources say about the chiefs involved?
Well, African chiefs often demanded things in return. Tribute, or payments, from the Europeans. This was partly recognizing their authority, partly compensation for allowing access.
So forms of payment.
Yeah, money, valuable goods, sometimes services, and they sometimes try to insist on fair trade practices for the European goods they received, trying to control the terms.
But what real leverage did they have in the face of this massive European machine?
That's the really tough question, isn't it? Their leverage was often quite limited, though they certainly tried to exercise what power they had. Sometimes they'd demand protection from the European security guarantees against rivals or external threats, maybe expecting military backup in return for access to slaves.
A dangerous bargain.
Very. They also insisted Europeans respect local customs sometimes, and they used negotiation tactics, delaying, bluffing, forming alliances, trying to get better terms, leveraging their control over local trade routes or resources. But ultimately, the sheer power imbalance, the constant European demand, it often forced choices that were, devastating in the long run.
And once these deals were struck or people were captured, what then?
Then came the march to the coast. Enslaved Africans captured, shackled, forced to walk, sometimes for weeks, to these coastal forts.
Held there, waiting.
Yes, waiting in horrific conditions for the ships to arrive. This led directly to the next stage, the brutal transport across the Atlantic, the infamous Middle Passage.
It's almost impossible to comprehend the suffering on those ships.
The sources paint a truly horrific picture. Overcrowding, disease, starvation, violence. The human cost is staggering and often deliberately minimized when focusing just on the economics.
Yeah.
And throughout all of this, you have to remember the European traders were operating within this cold, purely profit-driven mindset.
Maximize gains, minimize costs.
Exactly. Maximize gains at every single stage, almost always putting financial considerations way ahead of human life or suffering.
Pulling back again, this wasn't just one country. The transatlantic slave trade was this huge international operation. It evolved, different players came in and out over centuries.
That's right. The Portuguese were pioneers, really. Started way back in the 15th century. They set up those early trading posts on the West African coast, transported enslaved Africans, mainly to their colonies, especially Brazil. They kind of figured out the routes, the techniques, the brutal logistics.
And then others followed, seeing the profits.
Yeah.
The Dutch.
Yes. The Dutch became major players in the 17th century. They established powerful companies like the Dutch West India Company in 1621. They shipped enslaved people to their colonies in the Caribbean and South America, places like Suriname, Curacao. They became really dominant for a while in that triangular trade system.
Not distant being.
Oh, right. The triangular trade, that complex network connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Typically, European manufactured goods went to Africa in exchange for enslaved people. Then those enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, to the Americas,
Right.
where they were sold, and the ships loaded up with the products of their forced labor, sugar, tobacco, cotton to take back to Europe. A brutal cycle.
And the English got heavily involved, too.
Hugely involved. English merchants transported vast numbers of enslaved Africans to the British colonies in the Caribbean and North America. There was the Royal African Company, chartered in 1672, which even had a monopoly for a time. Ports like Liverpool and Bristol became massive hubs for the slave trade. England eventually became one of the, if not the, leading slave trading nations. The wealth generated was immense.
France as well.
France, too, very active, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. They had extremely profitable colonies in the Caribbean Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, Guadeloupe. They used enslaved Africans mostly for sugar and coffee cultivation there, and they also supplied enslaved labor to French colonies in North America, like Louisiana.
So it's this picture of multiple European powers, all competing but all participating and profiting from this system.
Exactly. They learned from each other, competed fiercely, but collectively they refined and expanded this horrific system of exploitation, turning human beings into a global commodity on a scale never seen before. These powers, and others too, profited enormously, and the result was the brutal exploitation of millions of Africans over centuries, and the consequences. Profound, lasting, devastating impacts on African societies and fundamentally shaping the economies, the societies, the cultures of the Americas.
So this deep dive, it really shows us the transatlantic slave trade wasn't an accident. It was a monstrous, deliberately constructed system, driven by that relentless European demand for labor, fueled by profit, built on expanding empires,
Right.
underpinned by these careful constructed, dehumanizing racial ideologies, and made possible through this complex, often incredibly violent process of acquisition in Africa.
It was a time when, raw economic interests, political calculations, deep-seated racial prejudice, and just this desperate chase for wealth all came together with an absolutely devastating human cost. And importantly, the system had the full backing of European states legally, institutionally, economically. And the impacts, the echoes of that system, they're still with us today, shaping global history in ways we're still grappling with.
Absolutely. As we wrap this up, maybe something for you to think about is just how deeply intertwined all these factors were. The economics, the politics, the racism, the sheer logistics. How did they all lock together to create and sustain such a brutal and transformative chapter of our global history? What stands out most to you about that interconnectedness?